Now, there's something that I want to make very clear, and that is that I have no intention of trying to convert you to my spiritual path. Also, I don't want to try to convince you that things like reincarnation, karma cause and effect, or enlightenment exist. Because for these things, there is no empirical evidence. There's no conclusive evidence that these things exist. So it's really a matter for you to decide for yourself. And it's not up to me to try to tell you these things exist or not. And anyway, you won't be clear on what my position is regarding things like reincarnation, karma, cause, and effect. And it probably isn't what you think. And I doubt you would even understand if I told you. That's not my purpose in making these videos. As far as I can see, there's a very small percentage of people for whom these videos would be relevant or helpful. And also, there's many people I think are better off not watching my videos. I mean, I've said before, if you don't want to be challenged, don't watch my videos and don't subscribe. And also, don't share the link with others who are like-minded, who, like you, don't want to be challenged. Because I don't want to upset people. For example, somebody who has very strong faith in their religion or their spiritual belief, then they don't need to watch my videos because they have something to get on with. They can practice their path without any doubts, with certainty. And they don't need me saying things that are going to upset them. It's not going to be helpful. And I don't want to upset people. Really, it's not my intention. Also, there are people who basically don't care. They're worldly. And if you tell them, well, there is such a thing as past and future lives, then they're like, well, so what difference does it make? I'm going to be reborn. I'm going to experience another life. I'm not going to remember it. So what difference does it make? Well, actually, it makes a huge difference. If there is such a thing as reincarnation or not, it makes a massive difference. But for those sort of people, then there's no point in me challenging them because they're not going to accept it. I mean, their basic attitude is, well, what difference does it make where the universe came from? You know, I'm here, I've got to live, I have to eat, I have to feed my family, and I have to get on with it. And it's totally irrelevant whether or not there is such a thing as a spiritual path. So those sort of people aren't going to be interested in my videos, and it's not going to help them, and I don't want to upset anybody. So don't waste your time. If you've got a completely materialistic view of the universe, then don't waste your time. Go enjoy yourself. You know, watch videos on sort of samurai wrestling or maybe on woodworking on YouTube. It'll be more productive for you. There's no point in wasting your time watching my videos. And then those people who have great faith in science. It's similar to people who have great faith in God or in their spiritual path. There's people who think that there's nothing better than the scientific methodology. And for them, then, there's also no reason to watch my videos. I suspect some of these people only watch videos on spirituality in order to refute these people, to make comments and to refute their position, saying it's illogical. What benefit is there in spiritual practice? What's been shown over the past few centuries that development in science, medicine, and technology has advanced the human race and improved human condition. Now, whether or not that is the case is debatable. You could say that our scientific development has actually led to more hardship. But in general, we don't want to give up these things, our material wealth, our advancements, you know. We want health care. Of course, the yogis of the past didn't need these things. They disappeared into the mountains. They weren't interested in advanced technology and things like that. They were only interested in progressing in their meditation. But nevertheless, these sort of people aren't going to benefit from my videos. They probably aren't interested. They'll only watch them in order to leave comments to refute my position. And if you want to do that, that's fine. I'm very happy. I'm very happy if somebody wants to refute my position. If you are able to point out a logical fallacy in my beliefs, then that will be very helpful to me. You become my teacher. But if what you're saying is just based on a lot of assumptions about what my beliefs are, or what the meaning of these words are, that are mistaken assumptions, then that's not going to be helpful. But it will help me to clarify my own position. So I'm not adverse to people raising questions, contradicting what I say, making statements, contrary statements. I think that's all very helpful. I've got no problem with that. But for you, it might be a waste of time. Because if you're already very fixed in your beliefs, and you're not interested in a spiritual path, then these videos aren't going to help you. They're just going to be a waste of your time. But this wasn't the main topic that I wanted to discuss today. I wanted to discuss something called the three experiences. There are three experiences that arise in meditation, and those are bliss, clarity, and non-thought. And the reason why I wanted to discuss these is to substantiate a statement I made earlier that we are basically spiritual materialists. And when I say we are spiritual materialists, I don't mean everybody is. I mean, there are a few people who aren't, but for the most part, everyone's just looking for what they can get out of it. Everyone's just looking for some kind of feel-good factor, or to acquire spiritual knowledge, to have experiences of higher consciousness, or to experience these three things: bliss, clarity, and non-thought. But it is taught, in the Buddha Dharma at least, that by clinging to these three experiences, we are reborn in the mundane world. We do not transcend. So these are not transcendent experiences, they are worldly experiences. And you might think, well, hang on, this is the goal of my meditation. I was taught by my Swami that if I rest in non-thought, then I will achieve awakening. But why is it that these three are mundane? Now, I've specifically chosen these three because, as I said earlier, and some people try to critique my position or refute me logically. That's okay, as I said. But they say that the things I refer to and talk about are mere theories and concepts that are derived from doctrine. They're kind of dogmatic positions that are not based on any personal experience. Now, whatever my personal experience is, you won't know, unless you have clairvoyance. And if you do, that's great. But I've chosen these three experiences because these are three things that many meditators will be familiar with. At least people who have seriously dedicated themselves to meditation, then they will be familiar with these three experiences. Right away, we have some common ground to discuss that we can identify as something that actually arises and aren't just concepts or something I've made up or taken out of a book. So why are these experiences mundane? Well, we can see that many people in the world go through a lot of hardship to acquire this experience of bliss. I mean, people put themselves through incredible hardship for the experiences of bliss that arise from taking narcotics. Things like heroin and morphine and that sort of stuff. And actually, to become a heroin addict is not a pleasant thing whatsoever. I guess these days there's something new called fentanyl or something like that. But it's basically the same thing. We're looking for bliss. But this kind of euphoria, feeling of happiness and bliss, is something that we value highly. In fact, it is the primary reason why people form couples. We need to have some kind of intimate relationships with another human being. And we become very attached to the bliss that arises out of sexual experience, and some people even pay for it, right? So this is a material goal. It's not a transcendent goal. We tend to think that it's something very, very special, but it's not really special. And the way it's taught in the Dharma is that clinging to the bliss of meditation leads to rebirth in this mundane world. When I say this mundane world, it's described as the desire realm. It's our realm, the realm that's based on desires. That's us. Desirous people. We want stuff, and especially in developed nations, then we want lots of stuff and all kinds of varieties of it. And it's very poignant to me, having returned to the West, then this intense focus on rampant materialism is very apparent everywhere I go. It's not present so much in the East, especially in poor countries like Nepal. Also, it's not necessary. It's a great hindrance to anybody's spiritual practice. Having all this choice and distraction is a huge obstacle to anyone's spiritual practice. And also, this is probably the most common trap people fall into, and that is thinking that this bliss is something special. Most of us will probably be familiar with the early days when we first started doing something like yoga or doing Tai Chi, let's say, or meditation. First, it's just something you look into. It's like a hobby. So you'll go and you'll do one yoga class a week, let's say. And in that yoga class, then you might start to feel the benefits of your practice, both physically and mentally. So you get this kind of feeling of well-being and happiness. And many people will think, well, one class a week isn't enough. I need to take this a bit further. And so you might sort of do a Saturday morning or do 2 or 3 a week. And for many people, then eventually they'll decide to go on a short yoga retreat. And it'll be the first time that somebody has practiced yoga sort of more intensely, like day and night for several days, with nothing else to focus on. So many of us will have done this sort of thing. When you do that, it is very common for kind of experiences of more intense physical and mental bliss to arise. This happens for many people. And that's not a problem. That's fine. In fact, seeing the benefits of your practice is a positive thing. That's the way it's taught. But what often happens is that people cling to this as being something special. They see it to be some kind of transcendent or enlightened experience. And you'll hear this. People will say, oh, I did a 10-day yoga retreat and I had this amazing feeling of bliss in my body. Clinging to that is a very negative thing. And it's the biggest trap and the most common trap for beginners on the spiritual path, because they see it to be something special. And then they spend the rest of their lives trying to recreate that feeling. I had this feeling, it was amazing. And then they work towards that, they try to find it or develop that experience. There's a problem with that, because this feeling of bliss or well-being is relative. When we're a beginner, then it seems really significant and important, something really special, maybe even signs of awakening. But then as our practice progresses, these experiences start to feel less significant. It's like anything. Once you get used to it, it becomes more commonplace. So this is very worldly. I mean, people will get a kick out of a drug, for example, and then they want to take it again. But the more you take that drug, the more desensitized you become to it. And so it becomes harder to get the same kind of high. This is a type of high, like a drug-like experience we're talking about. We're talking about chemicals in the brain, right? How do we know this is mundane or worldly? It's because this is all based on chemicals in the brain. Dopamine, anandamide, this sort of thing, serotonin. These things arise in meditation and in yoga, and they make us feel good. But clinging to them is just a type of addiction. And it's very, very common. And so I wanted to give you a kind of example of this in the modern day world. And we're all familiar with Jim Carrey, very, very famous person. And he claims to have had this kind of spiritual awakening. So again, as a kind of beginner, he started following Eckhart Tolle and his methods. And then one day he had this experience. And this is what I saw on the internet. He said, and suddenly I was thrown into this amazing, expansive feeling of freedom from myself, from my problems. And then he goes on after that to say, and ever since that day, I've been trying to get back there. It's like riding a wave. Sometimes I'm on it, sometimes I'm off. But at least I know where I want to go. And I want to take as many people with me as I possibly can, because the feeling is amazing. So you can see here that he's had this very common experience from his, let's say, contemplation or meditation, using the methods of Eckhart Tolle, which is primarily staying in the present moment. Now, this is a good method. This is very productive for one's shamatha meditation. But alone, it won't bring transcendence. But it will bring these feelings of bliss and well-being. And there are chemical and biological reasons why these things arise. By this kind of immersion, by concentrating, then we increase these levels of anandamide in the brain. And because of that, over long terms of absorption, then the frontal lobes become less active. And this gives us a sense of no self. It's a very physical and mundane experience. But that in itself is not transcendent, that's worldly. Because these things happen in other circumstances and conditions as well. For example, if we've had a very hard work to do, and then on the completion of that work, we also get this feeling of contentment. We've been very active, we've been concentrating, working hard to achieve something complex. And then once we've achieved that goal, we get this temporary feeling of well-being, maybe even bliss. And so it's very, very similar. But you can see from Jim Carrey's words here that he's seen this experience to be very special, and he's clinging to it, and he's now made it his goal. And at the end, his reason is because it feels so amazing. For some people, drugs feel amazing. For some people, sex feels amazing. For some people, jogging is addictive. There's all different ways to get our kicks. I mean, this was the theory of Frank Zappa. He said, it's all about what makes you come. That was his theory about music. It's just what gets your rocks off, basically. But this is worldly. There's nothing transcendent about it. There's nothing special about it. Everybody's trying to do that in different ways. And so we engage in all kinds of activities. What are these other two experiences? Well, we've got clarity and we've got non-thought. Now, this clarity one is a lot more difficult. And in fact, I don't really meet people who have understood or even experienced this clarity in their meditation. They don't talk about it a lot. Mostly people talk about non-thought and bliss. And the most coarse one is this experience of bliss. So let's just talk about non-thought. Now, as we know, then many Hindu practitioners use non-thought as their goal. They're not so much talking about bliss. In fact, many teachers will say, don't get attached to the bliss. But what they talk about is this resting in stillness. Okay? Ramana Maharshi, these kind of teachers, their practice is the practice of stillness, and this stillness is taught to be the essential state or natural state of the mind. Now, what is this peace? What is this non-conceptual, this non-thought state that is called perceptionless samadhi in Buddhism? Well, if we believe the words of a modern Hindu scholar, Ramesh Balsekar, then he says, this state of peace is that state of deep sleep. It's that state of non-thought that exists in deep sleep. So we know that in deep sleep, then all the consciousnesses dissolve and there's no longer any perception. So it is a perceptionless state. If this is our ultimate goal, then there's an easier way to achieve this. You can just take a general anesthetic, or you can get a bump on the head and lose consciousness, because this is also a state with no thought. And in fact, if non-thought is the ultimate or transcendent state, then a stone has got better meditation than I do, because a stone doesn't have any thoughts whatsoever. That might sound like a silly example, but it's true if you think about it logically. And why do we cling to this state of non-thought? Because, especially for people who are exceptionally neurotic, then it's our thoughts that plague us. So you may have heard of this term before, but in Sanskrit we talk about the kleshas. The kleshas are our afflictions, and our afflictions are negative emotions, or negative mind states. And so non-thought pacifies these. The more that we rest in non-thought, the more we undo our habituation to our negative ways of thinking and our kind of negative reactivity. And it's taught by clinging to non-thought in meditation, then we are born in the perceptionless states. And this is where the Hindu yogis are, well, they're actually seeking to be born in these states. But in Buddhism, it teaches that this is not the ultimate. The state of non-thought is not the ultimate thing. This perceptionless state is not the ultimate goal. It's useful in the world, again, as I said, if you're exceptionally neurotic, if you have strong addictions to drugs, etc., or even to sexual bliss, then non-thought will help you to undo these. And in fact, this is what we go to see psychiatrists for. We go for therapy for these kind of things, because we're thinking too much. We're all mixed up. We're thinking about all kinds of things, and all kinds of things upset us. If we can rest in non-thought, it undoes our clinging to these concepts that afflict us and plague us. So there's this other experience. It's called clarity. And it's difficult for us to understand what this is. I mean, most people, they've experienced bliss in meditation. Some have not, but most people, if they're serious or if they've dedicated themselves to meditation, then at some point, then bliss will have arisen. And for a good meditator, then it will arise all the time. And it's just basically things like dopamine, anandamide, and serotonin, these things increasing in the brain because of our physical concentration. And fewer people will have experienced non-thought. But for some they will, especially if they're serious meditators. They will have experienced this state where thoughts slowly disappear. Actually, what's going on there, whether thoughts have disappeared or not, is a different question. Somebody who understands Mahamudra meditation will have a very different take on this, but we can just say that meditation has removed thoughts or reduced thoughts. That's a beginner's understanding of what it is. Provisionally, then let's just say that this clarity is acute awareness. And so how are we attached to this, and how do we know this is worldly? So if we go to see a sensational Hollywood movie, or if we're engrossed in a very interesting novel, or even if we just go to see some performance by a band we like, then we have this kind of one-pointed focus on what we're watching. You know, when we're bored, then our mind drifts off to something else. But when we really like something, then we become really one-pointed and focused on that activity. And this is what we could say is clarity. Exactly what it is that appears to mind is not so apparent to us because we're distracted by something. Generally, if we're really interested in something, or if we really like something, then we will have very acute awareness. And this is a pleasurable experience. It's something we like. We like this alertness. I mean, if you're bored in a class at school and you're kind of falling asleep, right? It's not a sleepiness that you enjoy. It's a kind of boredom and a dullness. But this clarity is the opposite of that. It's a kind of engaged and acute awareness. And it arises for us, especially when we see kind of sensational acts and very interesting things. It draws people's attention. And so we're attracted to that. I think it's very clear to all of us why we're attracted to bliss and how that is very, very worldly. And then when it comes to non-thought, well, this is primarily attractive to people because it removes their thinking. Problem is we think too much, right? And so if we can rest in non-thought, it kind of erodes those neuroses that we have and makes us feel more at ease. And then clarity arises for us when we're very attentive and very attracted to something and we have this acute awareness. And these three experiences lead to three types of rebirth. As I said, then clinging to bliss brings about the manifestations of this world, this mundane world we live in. And then clinging to non-thought brings about the manifestations of the perceptionless realms. So that's the absorption in perceptionless meditation. And it is a perceptionless state. I mean, we only have to look at the life story of Ramana Maharshi. And there it tells us that he spent sometimes weeks immersed in a single perceptionless samadhi. And it was so deep that even when rats came up to bite at his legs, he wouldn't feel it. And then when he came out of his samadhi and he saw that the rats had been eating his body, he would sort of move somewhere else, like into the basement of a temple or something like that, to get away from them. And what does clarity lead to? Well, clarity leads to rebirth in the form realms. And it's taught that the noble beings will not be reborn in the formless realms, in perceptionless realms. Because being born in the perceptionless realms, then you cannot work for the benefit of beings. And so they are born in these kind of higher realms of the form realm, whatever that is. Whether you believe that or not, it's not up to me. I'm not trying to convince you these things exist. What you should know is that these are analogies. These are analogies for how we perceive the world around us. Because our world is based on our narratives, you could say, or our projections. And so if we fundamentally have one way of thinking, then we see the world in a similar way. And if we are immersed in non-thought, for example, then we don't experience anything, right? If you're in deep sleep, you have nothing arising to the senses, right? It's not dream state. Deep sleep is a blank state of nothingness. And so this is what you call the formless realm. And the form realm is this intense clarity or lucid awareness. The problem with all these topics is that they're very deep and there's all kinds of things that could be said. You could say a lot more about these three different types of realms. And also you can say a lot more about these different types of experiences. But I think we can all agree that these are not things that are made up. These experiences of bliss, non-thought, and acute awareness or clarity are things that we are able to experience, we can relate to. And so it's often the case within the Dharma that these terms are not just concepts. I mean, there are analogies used in the Dharma. And often the way that we have to interpret some of the terminology, then we have to kind of construct a story or a narrative to accommodate that. Like exactly what is rebirth. So when we think about rebirth, then we have to conceptually accommodate this idea that there is something that travels from one life to another. But the entire story about rebirth is an analogy, especially when you come to the higher levels of view in the Buddha Dharma. Because everything from the mind-only school upwards, then our reality is merely a projection of mind. If everything is a projection of mind, then you don't need a system where something physical travels from one life to another, right? All you need is for mind to make different projections based on their habitual tendencies. Well, that's the view of the mind-only school. It doesn't really fit with the middle way school. That's a bit more complicated. But again, we can't really go into it because it's just take hours to discuss this topic. What's important is to understand that there are these experiences that we interact with. We have perceptions of things. And those, we can say, arise to mind. Whether they're substantial, whether they're physical, whether they're emotional, etc., is debatable. But we can say that I have experienced bliss. I experienced non-conceptuality. I experienced non-thought. Or my mind was very lucid today. We can talk about these things. So that's a starting point for us to come to understand what reality is. These things, these very real things. So in general, the terms and the concepts in Buddhism all refer to something that we experience. For example, what is a birth or a rebirth? Or what we say, coming into being? Well, right now, what we experience in the room we're in the environment we are in, is our existence. It's a very visceral and seemingly real arising of appearances. So this is something we can talk about. And we can call this a rebirth in a realm. And when we're in deep sleep, well, we can logically assume that I was still alive when I was in deep sleep. I wasn't aware of anything. So I was existing. It's quite logical to think that, right? It's not like we disappear when we go into deep sleep. I mean, other people can tell us, you were asleep. And we'll think, oh really? I missed that. What happened? Well, you were asleep. So we're not conscious of it. But we can infer that we existed. And we existed in a state with no perception. And that is what we can call an existence, or what we call this intermittent state of non-perception. And also immersed in acute awareness, in profound meditation, then we can have this experience of clarity. Now exactly what that is quite difficult. If we talk about what clarity is and what awareness is, it gets very, very difficult to discuss. But we are able to mentally accommodate that, and it's not just something fabricated. And so basically everything within Buddhism has a referent to our perceived world. But sometimes then it seems like these are just concepts, or it's just a belief system. Like causality, okay, karma, cause and effect. We can just interpret that as a belief in something that isn't real. For example, there's some mechanism by which one action leads to a result in the future. Some magical thing that happens. For example, I have a bad thought about somebody, and then I bump my head, and we think those two are somehow related. We feel like there's some kind of magical connection, and so it's like a fallacy, right? But that's not really what karma means. If I let go of an object, then there's various causes and conditions. For example, there's the earth, and there's gravity, and so that ball will fall to the earth. And under certain conditions, then it might not fall, if there's an object in between it or something like that. And so, based on causes and conditions in the environment, then there's an apparent result of actions. And this is what causality talks about. But something you have to understand is that causality is not taught to be something itself substantial. When it means substantial, it's not real. It's not taught to be real in Buddhism. So to get worked up about karma as being some mystical thing that is somehow unscientific is not really anything other than a superficial understanding of what karma is. Just like rebirth. But again, as I said, I'm not here to try to convince you of these things. But I wanted to give you an example of how there is something that we have a visceral experience of, something we can actually directly perceive, and to see how that is related to our spiritual practice and our spiritual understanding. So I'm going to leave it at that because it's getting late and I have to look after my parents. But I thank you very much for your undivided attention, and I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.